I want to talk to you today about this article that you wrote a couple of years ago called Stop Telling Students to Study for Exams.
Yeah.
And in that article, you talk about this concept called instrumentalism.
Yes.
So can you tell me what instrumentalism is in the context of education?
Yes. Instrumentalism means that people only do things because there's going to be a direct result of it. So you can think of education in an instrumental sense as it's a means to an end. In other words, I take a course because it's required. I read a book because I have to. I study for an exam because there's going to be an exam that is going to grade me, and if I don't study, I will get penalized. So rather than having people view education as an end in itself, that is, that it has value just by virtue of the process of learning and studying and reading, we've set up a system where students feel that they only should be doing something if it's required, if there's an exam, if they will be held accountable to it. Now, much of our society is organized this way, and education just reinforces that, but I think ultimately it works against student learning.
Okay. And what kind of effect on students do you think that kind of teaching style has?
Well, I think what it means is that for them, learning is cramming information into their head in order to be prepared for these periodic assessments and exams that they're given. And so they begin to think of learning not so much as the acquisition of understanding and reflection, but rather learning is getting information into their head so that they can do well on an assessment in order to get a good grade in a course. And so I think in our effort to try to evaluate how well students are doing, we actually have created a system that has these unintended consequences, as we say, that ultimately communicate to students that really it's not learning for learning's sake, but it's learning particular things because you will be asked to know it at a certain time.
Right. And you talk about two types of brain functions in your article. You talk about retention and you talk about transfer.
Yes.
So can you talk about what both of those two terms mean and how instrumentalism kind of affects those two functions?
Yes, very good. So there's different definitions of learning. One definition I have found to be powerful and one which would lead us to think about education differently is the idea that learning only takes place when there's both retention and transfer. So retention means that after you've completed a course, you actually retain and remember some of what you presumably learned. Now, we know from research that if you ask students about 6 months after they complete a course, quite often there's almost nothing that they can tell you about the course. So retention is a necessary condition for transfer. And transfer means you actually take the information, the material, the content, the concepts, the ideas that you've retained, and you use them, you transfer them. So that is, they have some applicability to either another course, or they have applicability to your understanding of the world, or you're able to take that information and use it for other purposes. So that is the ideal, okay, of learning, that students remember what they learn and they're able to use it and transfer it in a variety of different contexts. We know that very few students are able to do that when they complete courses, so we ask ourselves, why is that the case? And from my perspective, the reason we don't realize that level of learning, that is retention and transfer, is because we've organized the learning process in such a way that students tend to study, i.e. cram, i.e. memorize material, and therefore they never really learn it, and they certainly don't understand it.
Okay. And what kind of academic rules or regulations foster this type of teaching?
Grades.
Grades?
We have to turn in grades. However, that isn't the only thing that determines what we do in the class. In other words, you can grade students, but you can provide alternative ways to assess them and alternative ways for them to engage with the material that avoids the midterm, final, 50%, 50% high stakes testing. So yes, we do have to submit grades. Therefore, we do have to create assessments of some kind to determine how well students are learning. And that can be done in a variety of ways, but there has been a tendency to think of grading as based on exams, high stakes exams at a certain point during the semester, and of course then we have final exam week.
Right. Can you talk about one or two methods of teaching that are better? Like, what's the solution?
The solution for me is the modes of assessment that faculty use in their courses. So we have something called formative assessments, and these are terms that are used in education and in evaluation and assessment. And so a formative assessment is you give students the opportunity to work through problems, to practice in the classroom, and then you give them feedback on how well they do. Or for example, I have a data analysis class. Students work on exercises in the class. They work at a different rate of speed, so sometimes rather than going over the results and the answers together, they have a key. So once they get done with the exercise, they look at the key, they compare their answers to what they should be, and then I go around and discuss. So in a smaller class, you can do that sort of thing. But the idea is they're not being graded. They're simply doing the exercises, the assessments as practice to develop their skills. And they get feedback on how well they're developing their skills. So that's formative assessment. Then what you have is what we call authentic assessment. And there's very little of this that's actually done in many classes. And what that means is, are we really assessing students on the kinds of skills and competencies and values they should have as a member of a discipline, right? So if you're a sociologist, what is it that sociologists know? What can they do? And do we actually have assessments for our students that gauge the extent to which they think sociologically, or to a large extent, are we assessing students on their ability to memorize? So the students who get the best grade are the ones that are best able to memorize short-term material for the standard kind of assessment.
Right. Okay.
So formative assessment, authentic assessment. Those are the key strategies.
All right. Last question.
Yes.
In your opinion, what do you think should be the purpose of learning?
Understanding. And self-understanding and understanding of the world around us. And this requires us to be able to take ideas and concepts and theories and use them and apply them critically to the world around us. That to me is the ultimate purpose of education. And unfortunately, as happens, and we study this as sociologists, we have intended consequences and we have unintended consequences. And much of what happens in higher education is unanticipated and unintended as in terms of the final results.
Okay. All right. Well, that should do it.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
I enjoy talking about these things, and I probably talk